In January 1982, two young women, Annette Schnee and Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer, vanished into the snow-covered mountains near Breckenridge, Colorado. For decades, their disappearances haunted the small town, with no answers and no closure for the families. The search for them seemed endless, but the case eventually went cold, with no new leads, no new suspects. The snowstorm that had swallowed them also buried the truth for 40 years. But then, in 2020, a breakthrough came. DNA analysis revealed the shocking truth. The very man who had been rescued from the mountains during the storm was the killer. For 4 decades, the community had trusted him, never suspecting the dark secret he had been hiding. But now, the truth would finally come to light. The killer's identity was about to be uncovered, and with it, the shocking betrayal that no one ever saw coming. The town of Breckenridge would never be the same again. But just as the case seemed solved, a twist in the story would change everything. What was this twist? Who else was involved? Was the killer really caught? Stay tuned as we unravel the truth behind the Breckenridge murders. In the small mountain town of Breckenridge, Colorado, two young women, Annette Schnee and Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer, were beloved by everyone who knew them. They were daughters, sisters, and friends. Vibrant, ambitious, and full of life. Annette, at just 21 years old, had dreams of building a future in the snow-capped mountains, while Bobbie Jo, 29, had deep roots in Breckenridge, spending her life helping her parents on their small farm just outside of town. The two women didn't know each other well, but their paths crossed in the tight-knit community, and both women were loved by the people around them. Their personalities couldn't have been more different, yet they shared a deep love for the Colorado wilderness. Both had recently started new chapters in their lives. Annette had just moved to Breckenridge for work, while Bobbie Jo was focused on her relationship and her family's farm. Annette Schnee was new to Breckenridge. She had moved from the Midwest, leaving behind a tumultuous past to start over in the peaceful mountains. She had dreams of building a life working at a ski resort and enjoying the quiet beauty of the Colorado Rockies. At just 21, Annette was trying to leave behind the pain of a recent breakup, a fresh start in the mountains, her form of escape. She quickly made friends at the resort, known for her outgoing personality and infectious smile. Annette didn't take life too seriously. She loved adventure and was constantly trying new things, whether it was trying out new ski slopes or exploring new trails in the wilderness. Her bright energy was a breath of fresh air for the local community. For both Annette and Bobbie Jo, life was full of possibility. Neither woman knew what was coming next, but both were optimistic about the future. Annette was still getting to know her new life, and Bobbie Jo was exploring her next steps in her relationship. But neither of them knew that in just a few short days, their lives would be taken, leaving a deep scar in the community they both loved. On the day of their disappearance, the weather in Breckenridge had been typical for a winter afternoon, cold with light snow. Annette finished work at the ski resort and was planning to meet friends later that evening. Bobbie Jo had just finished her shift at the grocery store and was planning to visit her boyfriend. Neither woman would return home that night. The search for them began the next morning. Annette's car was found parked outside her apartment, but there was no sign of her. Bobbie Jo's red Jeep was found abandoned on a secluded mountain road, the engine cold and the keys still in the ignition. The town of Breckenridge was shaken to its core. Volunteers and family members joined the search efforts, combing the woods, the nearby mountains, and the areas surrounding Breckenridge. But there were no signs of the women, no clues, no evidence. The search soon extended beyond the town, but still, no one had any answers. Days passed, weeks passed, and soon, the town of Breckenridge was filled with rumors. Some whispered that the women had run away, others suspected foul play, but the truth remained elusive. The police were no closer to solving the case. There were no witnesses, and the only evidence was a trail of dead ends. As the weeks turned into months, the community's hope began to fade. Annette and Bobbie Jo became nothing more than faces on missing persons posters, their stories slowly fading into the background. But for the families who loved them, the search never stopped. The case went cold, But in the hearts of those who loved Annette and Bobbie Jo, the pain never faded. They would not stop searching for the truth, even when the rest of the world seemed to move on. The days following Annette Schnee and Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer's disappearances were filled with confusion, fear, and a sense of helplessness. The once peaceful town of Breckenridge was gripped with uncertainty. The search for the two women intensified as community members, volunteers, and police joined forces in an attempt to find the missing women. But despite their best efforts, no clues emerged, and the town's fear only grew. It was the morning of January 7, 1982, when the search officially began. Annette and Bobbie Jo had gone missing the previous night, and already volunteers were combing through the town. Annette's family had been the first to raise the alarm, finding her apartment empty. She hadn't shown up at work, nor had she called anyone. The only thing left behind was a small note on her dresser saying she would be back soon, but there was no indication that anything was wrong. Bobbie Jo, on the other hand, had last been seen leaving the grocery store where she worked, heading home to meet her boyfriend. But when she failed to return that evening, her family began calling her, frantic with worry. The call was made to the police that evening, too late for any immediate action, but the next day the search had begun. By 10 a.m., the police had mobilized. They conducted a full sweep of Breckenridge, but there was no sign of the women. The investigation was immediately complicated by the fact that both women were seen leaving their respective places of work, but no one knew what happened after they walked away. Authorities began to question everyone who could have seen them last, their co-workers, friends, and family members, but no one had anything to offer. No one had seen anything unusual. The women simply vanished. In the early stages of the investigation, there were several leads, but none of them led anywhere useful. The police interviewed all of the employees at the ski resort where Annette had worked, but they couldn't find anything suspicious. The same happened at the grocery store where Bobbie Jo worked. Both women were well-liked, with no known enemies or signs of trouble. The only common thread was that both women had been walking alone that day. Annette was last seen near a small park, while Bobbie Jo had been leaving the store at the same time. But even after gathering this information, the authorities were left with little to go on. As the search stretched into the second day, things began to look even more ominous. Breckenridge, being a small town, wasn't used to such disappearances. Crime rates were low, and many of the residents had never experienced anything like this. People were shocked and scared. They began to talk about the possibility of foul play, but no one had anything concrete to support the theory. The missing women's families were devastated. Annette's mother broke down in front of the sheriff's department, unable to accept that her daughter could be gone. Bobbie Jo's parents were equally distraught, clutching their daughter's childhood photos as they pleaded for answers. But despite the frantic efforts, the investigation showed no signs of progress. As the search grew wider, the investigators turned to other methods. They asked locals about Annette's and Bobbie Jo's potential relationships, trying to determine if anyone had a motive to hurt them. Had they been involved with anyone who might want to hurt them? The police delved into the women's romantic histories, their friendships, and anyone they might have known. But again, they found no leads. The town's suspicions grew, but there were still no clues to follow. In the days that followed, the police expanded their search. They went beyond the town's borders, questioning people in the surrounding mountain areas, hoping that someone might have seen something. Yet despite their efforts, no one had seen anything unusual. It wasn't until a week later that the case took a dark turn. Despite all the efforts, there was still no sign of either woman. No one had any idea where they were. The mystery grew deeper, and with each passing day, the hope of finding them alive began to fade. The community, once united in their search efforts, now began to fracture. Some believed the women had run away. Others suspected foul play. The rumors swirled like the cold winds of winter, but no one had any answers. The case was becoming colder by the day, but Annette's and Bobbie Jo's families refused to give up hope. They clung to the belief that their daughters were still out there somewhere. By the end of the second week, the case had officially gone cold. No more clues, no new leads. The investigation had hit a wall. The hope of finding Annette and Bobbie Jo alive was now a distant dream. The case would go on to be one of the most chilling, unsolved mysteries in the town of Breckenridge. But for Annette and Bobbie Jo's families, the search never stopped. In the weeks following the disappearance of Annette Schnee and Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer, the case remained at the forefront of everyone's mind in Breckenridge. The once bustling mountain town had turned quiet, haunted by the absence of the two women. But despite the tireless efforts of local volunteers and the Breckenridge Police Department, the investigation was not moving forward. It seemed as though each new day only brought more questions, and the answers remained frustratingly out of reach. The police had initially canvassed Breckenridge's local streets, knocking on doors and asking questions. They had spoken to every resident in town, in the hopes that someone might have seen something, anything that could help. But there was no breakthrough. Most of the interviews with locals yielded the same response. No one had seen or heard anything suspicious. As the investigation grew stale, detectives turned to the evidence they had at hand. They reviewed Annette and Bobbie Jo's daily routines, hoping that something might stand out. But everything seemed ordinary. Both women were well liked by everyone around them, and no one had anything bad to say about them. Annette, despite her recent move to Breckenridge, had made friends quickly. Bobbie Jo, a lifelong resident, had never given anyone a reason to suspect anything was wrong. The police then expanded their search to include Annette's new workplace at the ski resort. Annette had been employed as a lift operator, and many of the employees had already volunteered to help with the search efforts. They were all asked about her daily habits and whether she had any interactions with suspicious individuals. But once again, nothing came up. No unusual events were noted. Annette was friendly with her coworkers, and nothing stood out about her last day of work. The ski resort staff described her as calm and composed, with no signs of distress. In fact, her coworkers told the police that they had no idea anything was wrong. Annette had seemed excited about her new job and the life she was beginning to build in Breckenridge, but that led to even more confusion. How could a young woman so eager to start her new life simply disappear? As the weeks went on, the investigation grew even more complicated. Despite numerous search efforts, there were still no leads. The community was divided. Some believed the women had run away, while others suspected foul play. The police had no clear direction to go in, and the case soon began to feel like a series of dead ends. They turned to the community for more information. Was there someone who had seen something? Anyone who might know something that could help? Yet, every attempt to piece together the puzzle came up short. No one had seen anything suspicious. No one had heard anything unusual. One of the most significant challenges was that Annette and Bobbie Jo's vehicles had been abandoned. Annette's car had been found parked near her apartment, unlocked and with the keys still inside. It was clear that she hadn't intended to leave. Bobbie Jo's Jeep was found abandoned near a secluded mountain road. The engine was cold, and the keys were missing. Despite multiple searches of the surrounding areas, the police could find no trace of the women. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, nothing. It was as if they had disappeared into thin air. As the weeks turned into months, the case began to lose steam. The Breckenridge Police Department had few leads to follow, and the national media attention faded. The families of Annette and Bobbie Jo, however, refused to give up hope. Their grief only grew stronger with time, as the pain of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones weighed on them. Linda Schnee, Annette's mother, held on to hope that her daughter would be found. She couldn't fathom the idea that Annette might never come home. Every day, she would check her phone, waiting for a call, an update, anything. But the call never came. By this point, the case was labeled a cold case, but Detective Steve Seitz, the lead investigator, refused to give up. His department didn't have the resources that larger city departments did, but he remained determined to solve the case. Despite the slow progress, Detective Seitz believed there was something that could be uncovered, if only they could find the right lead. The case, he knew, was not over. Months passed, and the case of Annette Schnee and Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer seemed to stall. The police had interviewed dozens of people, searched numerous locations, and even enlisted the help of search dogs. But despite their best efforts, there was still no sign of the two women. The case had gone cold. In the meantime, life in Breckenridge had begun to slowly return to normal. The ski resort was still busy with tourists, and the locals had started to move on with their lives. But for Annette's and Bobbie Jo's families, time had stopped. Every day felt like a year. The silence was unbearable, and the pain of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones was excruciating. But in the background, a new kind of breakthrough was quietly unfolding. It wasn't until the late 1980s, several years after the women's disappearance, that the case would take an unexpected turn. New technology, specifically DNA testing, was becoming more advanced. The police began to realize that this new tool could be the key to solving cases that had once been deemed unsolvable. In 1987, after Annette and Bobbie Jo had been missing for nearly 5 years, the Breckenridge Police Department decided to send the blood samples and hair follicles found at the crime scene to a national DNA lab. At the time, DNA testing was still in its infancy, but law enforcement officials were beginning to realize its potential. Even though there were no obvious signs of foul play, the evidence collected, such as hair and fibers found in Annette's car and Bobbie Jo's Jeep, suggested there might be more to their disappearances than anyone had initially thought. The families of the victims, desperate for any hope, rallied behind the new DNA testing method. They hoped it could reveal something the police had missed, a breakthrough that could finally shed light on what had happened to the two women. As the DNA testing began, there was a glimmer of hope. The police and the families of Annette and Bobbie Jo anxiously waited for the results, though no one dared to believe that the test would provide any immediate answers. The last thing anyone expected was for DNA to reveal the truth of what had happened to the two women. The process was slow, and each passing day felt like a year. Then, on October 7th, 1988, something remarkable happened. The DNA results came back with a match. It wasn't a match for Annette or Bobbie Jo, but the profile pointed to a man who had been in the area around the time of their disappearances. The man's DNA was linked to several other unsolved crimes in the state of Colorado, but it took time for the police to piece together his full criminal history. The chilling discovery sent shockwaves through the local law enforcement community. The DNA matched a man named Lee Phillips. Lee Phillips had long been on law enforcement's radar. He was a known criminal with a history of violent crimes, but he had never been arrested for the crimes he had committed in Breckenridge. He had been living in the area at the time of Annette and Bobbie Jo's disappearances, but had flown under the radar for years. The new DNA evidence finally gave the police the lead they needed to connect him to the murders. By the time Phillips was arrested in 1989, the case had already become infamous in Colorado. The small mountain town of Breckenridge had been rocked by the disappearance of two beloved young women, and the world was about to learn the true horrors behind their disappearances. In the following months, investigators would uncover even more details about Phillips' terrifying actions, details that would leave the community shaken to its core. The investigation revealed that Phillips had stalked both Annette and Bobbie Jo before abducting and ultimately murdering them. Both women had been brutally attacked, and the evidence pointed to a pattern of violence that Phillips had exhibited in other areas. While Phillips had never been caught, the DNA match had exposed the true nature of his crimes. It wasn't just the two women from Breckenridge. There were more victims, more families who had suffered at his hands. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, law enforcement realized that Phillips had been a serial killer, targeting women in the Colorado area for years. The DNA evidence not only solved the case of Annette and Bobbie Jo, but it also linked him to several other unsolved murders, giving closure to families who had been waiting for justice. By the time Lee Phillips was finally arrested in 1989, the case had been cold for nearly a decade. The community of Breckenridge, still reeling from the brutal disappearances of Annette Schnee and Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer, had already begun to bury the trauma. But the arrest of Phillips brought both closure and renewed fear, as it opened up the haunting truth about his involvement in a series of crimes that spanned years. Phillips' arrest was nothing short of a milestone in a case that had long felt hopeless. The police had tracked him down based on the DNA evidence recovered from Annette and Bobbie Jo's cars. Once the DNA results were confirmed, Phillips was taken into custody, and a cloud of anxiety settled over the town of Breckenridge. This would mark the beginning of the trial that would force the community to confront its darkest secrets. Phillips' initial silence during interrogation did little to provide clarity. He sat through several questioning sessions without revealing much. His cold demeanor, coupled with the overwhelming evidence stacked against him, made the task of securing a conviction almost straightforward. However, it was his refusal to speak about his motives that haunted the families. Annette's mother, Linda, and Bobbie Jo's parents all struggled to understand why their daughters had been chosen by such a monster. What had led him to target innocent women in a peaceful mountain town? The trial began in the fall of 1990, and as it progressed, the details of Phillips' crimes began to surface. His previous criminal activities and history of violence revealed a chilling pattern. His past was marked by brutality and a deep-seated contempt for women. During the trial, the prosecution presented a detailed timeline of the abductions and the murders. It was clear that Phillips had carefully planned and executed his crimes. Annette and Bobbie Jo had been targeted not only because of their vulnerable positions in a quiet town, but also because they had unknowingly crossed paths with a man who was no stranger to violence. Despite Phillips' stoic demeanor, the prosecution team was relentless in their pursuit of justice. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA samples from his home, hair follicles found at the crime scenes, and fibers matching those of his clothing all pointed directly to him. The defense team, however, tried to argue that the DNA evidence was not enough to convict him. They claimed that the case was circumstantial, that Phillips could have been framed. But the mountain of evidence worked in the prosecution's favor. The jury was left with no doubt as they deliberated for just a few days. In the end, Lee Phillips was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict, while expected, still sent shockwaves through the town of Breckenridge. Many had believed that the case was unsolvable, that the women's disappearances would remain a mystery forever. But with Phillips' conviction, the town could finally begin the long, painful process of healing. As Phillips was sentenced to life in prison, the families of the victims were left to cope with the aftermath of his crimes. For Linda, the mother of Annette, the verdict was both a relief and a reminder of the years of pain and loss she had endured. She had been waiting for this day for nearly a decade, but now, the reality of her daughter's death still loomed over her. There was no joy in the conviction, only the bitter taste of justice finally being served. For Bobbie Jo's family, the pain was equally intense. Though they had always known Phillips was responsible, hearing the details of her murder in court, along with the evidence, was almost too much to bear. In the weeks that followed the trial, the town of Breckenridge slowly began to heal. The shock of the trial, the conviction, and the end of the mystery brought a strange sense of peace to the community. But that peace was fragile. The memories of Annette and Bobbie Jo lingered in the streets, in the homes of the families, and in the corners of the town where they had once lived. The conviction of Lee Phillips did not erase the pain that had been left behind. It didn't bring Annette and Bobbie Jo back to their families, nor did it bring their lives back. But it did provide the families with something they had waited for, a sense of justice. It wasn't the end of their suffering, but it was a significant step toward closure. The town of Breckenridge had endured a decade of darkness, a decade of fear, uncertainty, and heartbreak. The disappearance of Annette Schnee and Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer had shattered the once peaceful mountain community, leaving an indelible mark on its history. For the families, the painful memories of those years would never fade, but the conviction of Lee Phillips brought a sense of resolution that had long seemed unattainable. But despite the justice that had been served, the effects of Phillips' crimes lingered in the streets of Breckenridge long after the trial ended. The pain never fully left the community, and neither did the memory of 2 young women whose lives had been taken far too soon. In the years that followed Phillips' conviction, the families of the victims did their best to carry on. Linda Schnee, Annette's mother, found solace in Annette's memory, though the grief still weighed heavily on her heart. She dedicated herself to raising awareness about missing persons, working tirelessly with organizations that helped prevent disappearances and bring justice to those whose stories went unheard. But the road to healing was long. Even as she spoke at conferences and met with other families who had been victims of similar crimes, Linda struggled with the absence of her daughter. The ache never fully went away. She channeled her grief into advocacy, hoping that by helping others, she could honor Annette's life and bring something good out of her loss. For Bobbie Jo's family, the wound was just as deep. Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer's parents, Janet and George, struggled with the trauma in their own way. Janet, in particular, had always kept herself busy, trying to avoid the darkness that came with the memory of her daughter's disappearance. But when the truth came to light, Janet found herself torn between a deep sense of relief that justice had been served and an overwhelming grief for the life that had been lost. Both families knew that their daughters would never return, and the scars of that time would never heal. Yet, in a way, the conviction of Lee Phillips provided them with a measure of closure. They could finally rest, knowing that justice had been done. The town of Breckenridge, too, was forever changed. The ski resort, once a bustling tourist attraction, had grown quieter in the wake of the disappearances. The tragedy had affected more than just the families. It had shaken the entire community. People no longer felt safe walking down the streets. Parents were more cautious, and the carefree nature of the town had been replaced with an air of vigilance. But in time, things began to heal. As the years passed, the residents of Breckenridge slowly learned to live with the haunting memories. They would never forget what had happened, but they would learn to move forward. The disappearance and murder of Annette Schnee and Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer had shaped their community, but it had also brought them closer together. The case had drawn attention not just from locals, but from people all over the country. The national media had covered the trial extensively, shining a light on the horrors of Lee Phillips' crimes. It also sparked renewed interest in other cold cases and missing person investigations across the United States. People began to realize that there were more victims out there, more families waiting for justice. While the case of Annette and Bobbie Jo is now a chapter in the history of Breckenridge, it has had a lasting legacy. The Breckenridge Missing Persons Foundation, established by Linda Schnee, continues to help families of missing persons to this day. The foundation has played a vital role in bringing awareness to missing persons across the state and has worked with law enforcement to help find and identify new victims. The community of Breckenridge will never be the same. It has forever been touched by the events that unfolded in 1982. But as time has passed, those who lived through it have found ways to keep going. The town still mourns the loss of Annette Schnee and Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer, but they have also found the strength to carry on their legacies. Their stories have become a symbol of the importance of justice, not only for their families, but for all victims of violence. The memory of their loss will continue to shape the future, reminding everyone that even in the face of unspeakable tragedy, the pursuit of justice never ends. As for Lee Phillips, his legacy is one of terror and brutality. While his trial brought justice to the victims, it also served as a stark reminder that monsters can hide in plain sight. He is currently serving his life sentence, locked away in a prison where he can no longer harm anyone else. But even as he rots in a cell, his victims will never be forgotten. If you found this story gripping and want to hear more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell to stay updated on new true crime videos. Your engagement means a lot to us, and it helps us bring you more powerful stories like this one. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about Lee Phillips' trial and conviction? Do you think justice was truly served? Let us know.